There we go. Peace and blessings, family. This is Adam Jackson, co-founder of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We want to thank you this evening for joining us for tonight's seminar on grassroots approaches to messaging progressive criminal justice policy. Again, my name is Adam Jackson. I just want to introduce you to the space and invite you to join us for a very lively conversation with LBS's Director of Research, Lawrence Grandpre. Before we get to the details of today's conversation, I want to encourage you to become a sustainer for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, because as you know, in order for us to do this work, it requires us to have a consistent level of financial support from community. And so I know that a lot of you are used to seeing LBS on your screens in the community doing community work. And I know that a lot of folks are always curious about how LBS gets it done. And the answer is you. And so if you appreciate, love, like what you see tonight and the work that LBS does, I strongly encourage you to go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain. I will be putting a link in the chat, and I do expect you to contribute and to become a sustainer today to ensure that we can continue this awesome work that is happening here in Baltimore. And so, yes, so again, I want to welcome to today's conversation with Lawrence, and we got Lawrence on the screen right now. We'll pull his presentation up in a second. So a lot of you have probably already seen a lot of the coverage that has been happening in corporate media around criminal justice policy with some of the corporate Democrats that are running for office. And so tonight's conversation is really centered around how we can message criminal justice policy and talk about it in a progressive way without undermining the interests of Black people, particularly working class Black people in places like Baltimore. And so just to kind of give you a sense of the flow before we get started. So Lawrence is going to give us a presentation. Now, again, I mean, if you've seen Lawrence present on anything on our platforms, you know it is time to bust out your notebook, bust out your pen and pad, because you got to take these notes on what my man is going to be rocking tonight. So feel free to get yourself situated, because it's going to be, he got some heavy hitting information to give you this evening. So I encourage you to take notes. And after we finish with Lawrence's presentation, I'll be helping him run the question and answer period. And so we'll be running through any questions you have. This is a webinar, so we expect you to be interactive. If you're watching on StreamYard, then you can just comment in the chat with any questions, any feedback, anything that you think is interesting about tonight's conversation. But if you're also watching on Facebook or YouTube, you can also give us feedback and comment as well. And as always, with every LBS presentation that happens on these platforms, it will be available on demand immediately after it is complete. So again, after the presentation from Lawrence, then we're going to have Q&A. And like I said, I encourage you to like that chat room up. Make sure you go into the comments. And also, if you want to introduce yourself, tell us who you are, why you came. We want to make sure we know who's here with us this evening and who's contributing to the conversation. So that way we can leave tonight not just learning about this topic, but also connecting with one another and building community as we do in every LBS space. So I've done enough talking. So just to remind you again, become a sustainer for LBS, and I will kick it to Lawrence to get us started this evening.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Lawrence Grandpre. I'm Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We're a grassroots think tank based out of Baltimore. Thank you for coming tonight. A little bit about myself. So LBS has been around for about 15 years. Many of us are born and raised in Baltimore. I was born and raised in Baltimore. Mother was a former state trooper, became a teacher. Father was a cop in the Baltimore Police Department for over 20 years. Did and coached debate for over 15 years. And working with LBS, I'm director of research. So I help support the policy agenda with research, and I do talks like this. So this talk really comes out of our experience as a revolutionary Pan-African organization that calls ourselves a think tank, because when we did debate, our opponents from other schools would go on to work at think tanks, policy shops to do research and give lawmakers policy recommendations, basically doing policy for the left and the right that runs the world. And no one was doing that from our perspective. And doing this work, we realized we got people who were calling themselves allies, fellow travelers, who were really trying to give us what they thought was useful advocacy frameworks, useful progressive leftist approaches to criminal justice. And when we would talk to people in community about these approaches, they were generally very unenthusiastic and sometimes outright antagonistic. And that can often be coded as Black communities are conservative when it comes to crime. But I think it's something deeper than that. And this talk really stems from our belief that it's necessary for grassroots folks who have a perspective and years of skills and research advocacy and doing direct policy advocacy, not just research, to really speak back to what is this narrative on the so-called progressive left, but also nonprofit policy spaces that we don't know how to talk to Black people about criminal justice. Why aren't they being full-throated advocates for our policies based upon the fact that they're disproportionately impacted by over-policing? So this is John Henry Clark. He is, so a few things. I'm going to speak to you for about an hour. Thank you for coming tonight. We're going to do Q&A. All this is going to be via text today. When we use Zoom in the future, we're going to be able to use the Zoom room to give you the ability to do audio Q&A. So for future talks, those will be on Zoom. Please sign up so you can get the Zoom link. So if you can please not just put your questions in the chat, but also your name and your organization. It's really, really useful for us to be able to say who came, who heard our message, who we're influencing, who we've reached, so that we can go to people and tell them this is what we do. This is who we talk to. This is the ability for us to reach our people. So just a little bit about this photo, and I'm going to start my timer now. Can't promise I'll stick to it. Begin about an hour. This is John Henry Clark. I was doing this talk and I was doing research, and I realized there was a quote from this person that really was basically the entire talk in a nutshell. And I'm going to sandbag you a little bit. I'm going to save the quote, but the politics of order and obligation, for me, that is the Rosetta, part of the Rosetta Stone that explains the disconnect that we're seeing between the Black community and the progressive community on crime. But first, I'm going to explain a little bit more about who we are. So we come out of the world of debate in the collegiate policy debate. This is our director of public policy, Davon Love, on the left. He was one half of the first two-person team of Black college debaters to win a college debate national championship. And again, we went into doing policy work after doing campus organizing and debate on Towson University's campus. Towson's in the suburbs of Baltimore City in Baltimore County in 2010. And I want to walk you through some of our work that we've done. So again, we do direct political advocacy. So we're not a nonprofit. We made a very intentional decision not to be a nonprofit, because there was some of our elders that told us much of the radical energy of the 60s and 70s was sucked up, not just through COINTELPRO, but through nonprofits, professionalizing and putting limits on the political possibilities of those who worked in nonprofits. That's not a critique of people that work in nonprofits. That's an example of how the political reality of needing to make payroll and get grants uses the love we have for each other and weaponizes us to force us to do forms of compliance and form of political overt and covert compliance that limit our political possibilities. This is us in Annapolis. This is us in the halls of power. But we're also working in the community, working with youth. This is us doing our debate camp. So we hosted a national debate camp, overnight debate camp, 2 weeks on the HBCU campus. We called it the Eddie Conway Liberation Institute. Eddie Conway is a formerly imprisoned Black Panther. So it wasn't just teaching folks how to win with debate, though we did have high school and college debate champions come out of that camp. It was exposing them to folks like Eddie Conway and Black elected officials doing work in the community on the very issues that we work on. Now, when the Baltimore uprising happened in 2015, we had our big protest. Someone named Freddie Gray was killed near a public housing project in West Baltimore called Gilmore Homes. We were leading some of the protests, but this actually, I believe, wasn't for the Freddie Gray protests. This is for subsequent protests that were led by some of our former debaters, organizing around things like racial equity and gender equity for folks who were being propositioned in exchange for repairs and public housing. So we actually occupied City Hall and did advocacy around a variety of issues after the Freddie Gray uprising. But we also worked on a lot of issues getting money to communities. So this is one of our first times we worked on getting public money to the community. So this was a SAMHSA grant that was for trauma-informed care. They wanted to give it to the University of Maryland. Folks came in and said, that's BS. We're going to call it out. We worked with the folks. They re-engineered it into something called B-City, which is a community-led grant-making organization giving out grants to community organizations in West Baltimore to this day. But we also work on criminal justice. So we've worked against mandatory minimums for years. This is one of our first posts that we made against mandatory minimums in 2017. Baltimore, oftentimes the murder capital of America, pushing back against the notion that we need mandatory minimums to address crime. But again, continuing to work on getting money to the ground. So when the Baltimore City Youth Fund happened, this was after the uprising to create a roped off $10 million per year, approximately, fund for youth. We were helping to structure it to say it's not going to go to white saviors. It's going to go to grassroots community organizations. And when they wanted to bring a spy plane to Baltimore, we were some of the folks saying that's going to be used to target political activists. That's going to be used to criminalize community. They're saying it's going to be used to track suspects. But we know when you give these folks these tools, they use them against political activists and the community. So again, we have podcasts that talk about this. So the reparations work. So Maryland legalized cannabis. You don't tax medical cannabis. You tax recreational cannabis because you don't tax medicine. That produces tax revenue that often goes to the general fund, goes to police. We worked in Baltimore starting really in 2015 to get that money to go into a community reparations fund for the war on drugs. And our big thing in 2025, please sign up for our email listserv. It's fighting the continued criminalization of youth. There's a big obsession over youth carjacking people on the streets, so we're fighting that. So why did I just give you all that background? I know some of you don't know us, so I wanted to tell you who we are. But honestly, if you want to know how to be credible to Black people when it comes to the issue of crime, you could probably just stop this talk right now. Don't stop this talk right now. But our history is why we are seen as credible on crime. Because every time we've come to the community to talk about criminal justice issues, they've already seen us work on issues addressing the upstream economic investment, community investment, youth development work that the community believes is fundamentally inseparable from criminal justice reform. So this is a talk explaining why we did the past 15 years of work of our organization the way we did, and how that is so different than how most progressive organizations on criminal justice work. Why community sees this is so important to getting credibility on the issue, and how to understand the systems and histories and culture about what is going into communities' decisions on this. So a few guidepost bullet points. So we're going to do an analysis of the standard left narrative on crime. We know the left is not standard of anything, it's not uniform, but we have to make some, we have to be able to do our work. So we have to sometimes create some sort of symbolism, some sort of unification around what people generally say when they produce these sort of progressive leftist approaches on crime. We're going to use data to evaluate the accuracy of the standard narrative. We're going to do an analysis of African culture to understand how it relates to Black communities' views on crime and progressive advocacy. And finally, we're going to identify holistic advocacy strategies centering on building community power and institutions, if necessary, corollary to progressive approaches on crime and public safety. So this is, again, it's going to make sense at the end. Again, this is very simplistic, but I'm going to now run down for you what I believe is my good faith version to encapsulate how many people in the nonprofit advocacy space, the so-called political left, talk about progressive approaches to crime. So let's start with the New Jim Crow. I know not everybody is completely in love with this book. I'm not necessarily, but that's where a lot of people start. Prison and policing is an extension of slavery and tied to mandatory minimums and war on drugs policing. So things like The Wire, things like locking kids up for dime bags of weed, aggressive policing practices, private prisons is another big part of this narrative. The boon in incarceration being critical to make profits off of people in jail. The crime bill, folks like Senator Joe Biden. But also, this is really important. So many of you might know this book, James Foreman, Locking Up Our Own. He's writing about how the Black political classes and Black grassroots advocates in some cities were actually instrumental in pushing tough on crime policies, not just people like Joe Biden, which gets us to admittedly divided views within the so-called left. about Kamala Harris. Do you support Kamala, push her to the left? Do you attack her? And do you challenge her? Do you say this is what James Foreman talked about? Intelligent people can disagree on that, but this is a critical part of the standard left narrative. But there's a problem. If you look at the Black community, because this is polling of the Black community from 2024, broken down by age, you can see a massive delta in support for defund amongst the youngest demographic, defund police, 18 to 26, and the oldest demographic, 65 and older. Again, not everybody's doing defund. It's just one of the easiest examples. I'll get to other stuff later, but it will serve as a critical nexus point for this debate. And of course, the issue with that is that old people vote, especially in the Black community. You can look at this chart and see the delta between the turnout percentages of people 18 to 24 being around 45%, if you believe that. We'll talk about the limits of this data later, but a much higher turnout percentage of those 65 plus. So let's talk about what this means in terms of boiling down the narratives coming out of the left. We're wasting money on policing and jail. Once people see this, we'll get to shift the money to stuff upstream, jobs, schools. This is a critical part of the standard narrative. This is not to say these are bad arguments. This is to say this is what I hear if I had to take a boiled down view of 10 years of hearing these arguments, 15 really. This is the sort of some common points. Decarceration does not increase crime. In fact, crime is declining. So look at California, had a big lawsuit on prison overcrowding. They had to let people out of jail, and crime did not increase during those periods of time. So that's a critical talking point. Defund the police and fund public health-based approaches to address violence. Another critical talking point. Address poverty via broad-based economic redistribution. And finally, eventually, prison or police abolition. So this is my attempt to present a good faith encapsulation of common arguments that we hear on the left. But now I want to introduce you to Miss Jones. Miss Jones. Mrs. Jones is a stand-in for the assortment of Black grandmas that we have met and that you may have met if you have done this advocacy work in working class Black communities. So again, we are going to produce encapsulations in order to do our work, right? So some things about Miss Jones. She's a Block mother, not just a Black mother, but a Block mother. So beyond her immediate family, she serves as a critical node for people in her community. Saw the impact of deindustrializations and crack and mass incarceration firsthand. Works in Sandtown, Winchester neighborhood of Baltimore. We'll explain why that's important for one of our case studies later. Engaged in community associations. So these are folks that may own homes in communities, that may be talking to police about community policing, talking to police about, hey, those kids are on the corner, they're scaring me. These are seen as the boogeymen by many folks in the leftist advocacy space about why Black folk are so conservative on criminal justice issues. Works to address abandoned homes and addiction in her community and attends local church. So this is just some things to put into context. And these are many things that folks would say show that she's not engaged in progressive politics. She's not listening to leftist podcasts. She's not hearing Adolph Reed talk about class-based politics and Black elected officials selling out the community. And I think that leads some folks in the leftist space and the nonprofit advocacy space to see her as an enemy to organize around. So I'm asking you to take Ms. Jones seriously. Granted, this person is not ignorant of every point you just made. So all those leftist progressive policy points, she's not going to be able to rattle them off like I just did. But I'm asking you for the sake of this talk to listen and assume she's heard those before in some way, shape, or form. And then not that they haven't engaged the argument, not that they're inherently dismissive of it, but they've come to fundamentally different conclusions on every single point based upon information they have and you don't. And that's where it's important to challenge ourselves. Many folks in this call are probably college educated, very well read, listen to a lot of podcasts. And they may see folks who are not as traditionally schooled or invested in Marxist or intersectional knowledge as not having this knowledge. And I'm asking you for this talk to understand that they may have information you don't, and you can read communal politics around fidelity to Miss Jones and what she believes. So other people in community, Miss Jones serves as a Block mother, a node of political power. So not just someone who's a loudmouth or a busybody, but a node of political power. And if you want to understand Black communal politics, understand what she believes and why she believes it. So I decided to organize this talk roughly around 3 things that the Miss Joneses of the world have been saying to us at LBS for about 15 years. And if you can understand what they're saying behind what they're saying, you'll be able to message your policies better around these issues. So the first, it's worse now than it's ever been. The kids are bad, things are bad, everything's bad. Second, I support what you're saying, but some of these folks are a problem. Third, y'all talk a lot, but y'all ain't gonna do nothing but help you and your people. So if you can hear the logic and the empirical analysis behind these 3 points, you can tailor your responses in ways that recognize the truth in what she's saying, recognize that even if you don't believe it's true, there's a system of cultural analysis that is explaining why she is seeing the world this way, and you have to be responsive to her truth. If you don't, you may never win her over, but you may take her from a 100% no to a 40% if it happens, fine. I may not like it, but whatever. And that's a win. So again, thank you for hopping on. I'm Lawrence Grandpre, leads a beautiful struggle. We about to really get into it. This is some deep stuff. Please put your name and organization in the chat. And we're going to just rock off and keep it going. So to understand how we approach these concepts, you first have to understand some core concepts. This is the absolute 100% Cliff Notes version. So Marimba Ani wrote a book called Yurugu. She is formerly Donna Richards, formerly a member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That was a break in SNCC. Some people wanted to, they say, kick the white people out, but really it was to have the white people organize only in their own white communities, which was always the plan. And some people wanted to continue with the interracial, multiracial organizing path. She went with the former. And after she leaves SNCC, she changes her name from Donna Richards to Marimba Ani, writes a book called Yurugu, which is her attempt to comprehensively talk about Eurocentric thought systems. And there are 2 concepts in her book, not just her book, but she's a good example of 2 central thought systems that will be important to understand some things I'm going to talk about. First, the distinction between rhetorical ethics and existential ethics. And I'm going to bring up a brief graphic at the end to recap all this. So she sees Eurocentric thought systems as being centered on rhetorical ethics or symbolic ethics. So we as a country symbolically have a free constitution, a free media, but in reality we're a nation built on slavery, capitalism, but the rhetoric of freedom is necessary to convince ourselves we're not an empire, we're not based on slavery. She sees that as endemic to European colonialism, and ideas of high-level thought and high-level logic and even science being manufactured to justify notions of abstract freedom as opposed to existential ethics, which is in reality, in the flesh, in the communal context, what is producing life and flourishing and what is not. So rhetorical versus existential ethics, Eurocentric, rhetorical, African-centered, existential. This is the next critical one. It's going to come up over and over again. So up and down, left and right, black and white, that's a dichotomy. Die to cotomy cut dichotomy. African systems often operate in diunital systems. So it's opposed to up and down being completely distinct. They often operate synergistically, cycling back and forth between each other. So the same person can have one belief and an apparently entirely contradictory belief at the same time. To understand black people and crime, you must understand that reality. So this is not just stuff we think is cool. This is stuff that's going to help us do our work. And sorry, that's supposed to fade out. But again, Eurocentric, quantitative, rhetorical ethics, dichotomous, African-centered, holistic, existential ethics, and diunital. So why Miss Jones does not believe crime is declining? The standard leftist answer is the media is getting to her. Nobody ever believes crime is declining. The media, Fox News, Sinclair Media is pumping up people's heads. Baltimore is the home base of Sinclair Media. So we hear this argument, but I'm asking you to consider an alternative framework. So I did a little math for you. In 1993, some of the height of the crack era, one of the highest murder rates in Baltimore City, the murder rate was 335. This is in a city of a population of 725,000. That equals approximately 44.6 murders per 100,000 residents. 2023, we had a historic decline in murder rates that was celebrated nationwide to 262 murders. But our population has declined to 570,000 people, which is a murder rate per 100,000 of, 45.9. And remember, the population declines in poor working class black neighborhoods are higher, and the murder rate there is higher. So when Miss Jones tells you crime is worse than ever, despite all the national leftist media telling you this is an irrational talking point, crime is declining, in her hood, that's actually true. And it's easy to, people do this Baltimore exceptionalism saying Baltimore is just so unique. You need to listen to what people are telling you because they may have access to forms of knowledge that you don't. Because let's keep going. What we know is that crime is massively underreported. And this is actually a graphic talking about the delta between total victimization as reported on surveys and what people report to police. So the idea is that, yeah, we know crime is not reported, but even when you account for crimes not being reported, crime is declining. Can't they see what we're selling them is working? Let's talk about that. So who's most likely to report crime? The least likely people to report crime, according to this study, less than college educated Black men. So for the people who we know are the highest victims of assault, the highest victims of non-lethal murder, they're actually reporting crimes the least. So just looking at crime reporting data in aggregate ignores the subsection of non-college educated Black and Hispanic men and white men who are most likely to be subject to non-lethal violent crime, who Miss Jones is seeing get beat up, get stabbed, and not report that to police, but they're not going to the cops, right? So again, this is not about reporting crime. This is about even the survey data we have does not accommodate for this dynamic. So if you look at this book, Becky Pettit, Invisible Men, what she is saying is that if you look at data collection methodologies, they assume you are in a household. The people least likely to be in a household stably, they're couch searching, they're being bouts of homelessness in between jobs, are non-college educated Black men because of their criminal justice involvement. So even the American Community Survey, the gold standard of data collection, is massively undercounting specifically non-high school educated Black men on every single metric. So none of the data we have about this group is reliable. And if you actually look at the study, this is what the high school graduation data says on paper. It says that the high school graduation gap between whites and Blacks has been shrinking for over 30 years and is pushing towards parity. This is seen as a great success of progressive organizing in politics. But if you account for the fact that a lot of Black men are in jail, so therefore cannot be counted towards this survey, but even the ones that aren't are not accessible to the surveyors. This is the data she comes up with. So that top line is what she believes the adjusted graduation rate for Black men is, and there's no improvement whatsoever. So the best data, the best knowledge that you are trying to sell to the Black community about progress being made because of the investments, because of progressive economic distribution, when you actually account for the people that Miss Jones knows, that the surveyors don't know, it's basically the same as it ever was. Maybe a little bit worse because of all the murders and assaults that your surveys aren't reporting. So if we take all that into consideration, once we analyze statement one, it's worse than ever, you have to see that the everyday experiences of violent crime are far higher than any number can show. And that this is an embodied reality for people living in communities experiencing the brunt of police and intercommunal violence. And also, lived experience and nuanced data analysis questions not only narratives on crime, but on whether the concessions ones through mainstream politics have created progress at all in the Black community. So whether you're trying to sell folks on drug policy reform, violence prevention, economic investment, unions, their perception of whether things have gotten better because of the so-called wins that you think are clear wins may not match up with their lived experience. And if we actually look at the data more deeply, we may find out they're more right than the people we're trying to sell to them as, look at the data, crime is declining, things are getting better, just help me keep it going. Statement number two, I agree with y'all. Some of these folks are a problem. So let's actually look at the data. This just came out a few months ago. This is the Policy Shop at UChicago. This is Kathy Cohen, Perspectives on Community Safety from Black America, a decent size sample of Black surveyors, so just Black folk. So just as an overview, when people say Black elders are conservative, that is an overgeneralization. You can see here the majority of them believe police violence is part of a larger systemic issue, just like all other generations do. So assuming that Black folks are conservative universally is a misnomer. They believe policing is a problem just like everybody else. They just got some other stuff they're thinking about. Let's actually look at some stuff here. So invest in housing security programs such as land trust, permanent housing, and individual experiencing homelessness. 92% support from 65 plus. Only 75 support 18 to 26. What's up with that? Invest in community organizations that address local safety needs. 92% support from those 65 plus. 93, 60, 41, 64. 76, 18 to 26. That does not jive with the narrative that we get from the standard narrative about old folks being conservative. Let's keep it going. Ending restrictive policies that continue to penalize people living after they have served their sentences in crime, such as limiting access to housing and jobs. 80% support, 65 plus, 86, 41 to 64, 85, 27 to 40, 75%, 18 to 21. What's wrong with the younger generation? They're so conservative, right? Providing legal protections for formerly incarcerated individuals when they face discrimination in employment and housing, 85%, 65 plus, 77%, 18 to 26. And one of my personal favorites, or reparations for the war on drugs. Again, they're a little bit more conservative, not much, not necessarily an expected result. This is my personal favorite, a somewhat expected result, but we're going to talk about why this is interesting to me. Ending practices such as forcing prisoners to fight fires or clean up debris, or less than $1 an hour in similar forms of slavery and legal punishment. 77% support in the younger generation, 57% support in the older generation. So still a majority, but much, much lower in the older generation. And that particular example, cleaning up debris, fighting fires, why are they more likely to support that? We got to talk about it. Of all the different messages for invest, divest around how we should take money from police and invest in other stuff, which one is least likely to appeal to older Black folks? It is the social welfare framework. And they dislike it so much, it is below water. It's the only one below water, below 50%. And they like it less than Black Republicans do. So there's something about social welfare that seems to be rubbing elder Black folk the wrong way. And we got to talk about it. So I know it's a lot. And data is data, but we need an expanded framework. The last thing I want to say is that as much as we talk about Black people being conservative, no generation of Black folks supports defund the police, not abolish, but defund the police at over 50%. So Black folk in general is like defund, redistribute, maybe, yeah, but no generation is more than 50%. So while we put it all on the elders, Gen X, it's more complicated than that. Obviously, 65 plus is very much 84 to 16%, but no generation is more than 50%. So what's going on here? What are some tools that we can help understand how to interpret this data? So this is a text from Martin and Martin, both from Baltimore, Spirituality in the Black Helping Tradition. So if we understand African people, we have our own indigenous cultural system about how we help each other and heal each other. So they talk about race work. So this is the work done in Black institutions before integration. Churches, fraternal sorority organizations, and they identify certain characteristics of that work, like belief in mutuality, agency, social debt. Social debt's going to be important, character building, and family development. And they had a brief quote from that text around race work. So this is Martin and Martin, Social Work in the Black Helping Tradition. By giving race work scholarly coherence, Carmel and Du Bois gave early social workers and other Black helping professionals a positive, hopeful, forward-looking, spiritual outlook at a time of peonage, age, chain gangs, political disenfranchisement, de facto and de jure segregation and lynching. They gave them a positive concept of race and Blackness. They gave them a sense of race mission at a time when white scholars were predicting that Black race, now fleeing from white plantation paternalism, was doomed to extinction. They helped them see communalism as key to Black race survival and uplift, and see dangers of individualism and egotism. They helped early Black social workers to concentrate less on global racial concerns and focus more on the attention of character building to mental and moral improvement, family preservation, viewing the family as a sacred institution, and family development by trying to create a modern version of the communalist African tribal village. So the communalist African tribal village, Martin and Martin say, via race work, via the helping traditions in independent Black institutions, is an essential framework to understand Black people today. So what do we need to understand about the African communalist tribal village? This gets us back to the very first photo in this presentation of John Henrik Clarke. When John Henrik Clarke went to Ghana, famous independent Black scholar, worked at Cornell, essentially an autodidact, with an advisor to Malcolm X, studied African civilizations, their cultures, their customs, lectured in Harlem for decades. Very well, even got a shout out on Killer Mike's most recent album. He was talking to J.B. Dankwa, who is a liberation nationalist in Ghana, and about the fact that there were African societies that did not have a word for jail in their language because it was not needed. And J.B. Dankwa asked John Henry Clark, according to John Henry Clark, look into our history and figure out why that was possible. And according to Clark, he went back to Dankwa and said it was possible because African people organized themselves to a system of honor and obligation. So it is communal, cultural honor and obligation within the Black community that created societies that had no word for jail because it was unnecessary. Now, that does not mean there was no accountability. Actually, it's the opposite. It's just that accountability wasn't through a hierarchized, punitive system that had a jail as the vision. It was through other mechanisms. So how do these things work? So this is the text that's going to give us our only long quote of the night. So this is African Cosmology of the Bantu Congo by someone with a very long name. It's difficult to pronounce, but Fukiao is the last name. So Fukiao is someone from the Congo who lectured in America in Boston during the 80s and 90s, did programming where folks returning from prisons that was seen as very successful because he was intentionally harnessing what he saw as the systems of African culture and African indigenous conceptions of crime and accountability, honor, and obligation. So this is a quote from his text, African Cosmology of the Bantu Congo, in which he presents his analysis of Bantu conceptions of crime, accountability, and how they work in the context of contemporary issues of crime and punishment. It's a bit long. It's very important. I'm going to read it for you. Nothing in daily life of Congo society is outside of its cosmological practices. The children to be born engendered by parents in their Congo should serve the community. The child does not belong to the parents. It is a collective and societal relationship, says the proverb. The society accepts as automatically the responsibility to raise all offspring of such a lingo, whereby the African saying, it takes a whole village to raise a child. Without this brief summary, I thought it would be difficult for certain readers to comprehend the African thought concept of law and crime. When the conceptual parts of African traditional legal aspects will be easily understood thanks to some of this previous explanation. He continues. The existing legislature in Africa cannot free African people because the legislature is sterile and alienated from its true culture. As Yaliba says, the law becomes sterile when one separates it from its milieu. The law is not only a set of techniques of analysis, but a vehicle of culture. That law, in order to take root in African society and serve as a cultural vehicle, must rise from within the people's culture. The law must speak the same language spoken by the people and be written in that language. The African masses fight today because their present leaders continue to follow the path of a very negative capitalism, which is not their way of life. Capitalism results in crimes against innocent and peaceful people by preventing their access to their ancestral tabooed lands and the joy of liberty, the liberty of political participation. The African masses see their behavior of their leaders as public crimes. The human being is a system of systems. The dual of the being continues to act and to talk and among the community's members, as well as the world's communities, through dreams and visions, waves, radiations, and through monumental acts. There is no end to the dingo process, the potential going and coming back of life. It's almost impossible to find the English correct conceptual meaning. This tells us how impossible it is to impose a new system that cannot possibly fit on the people who already have their own system of thought. One cannot dance with ease in a borrowed rap. It is wrong for one system to try to manipulate or impose one way of thinking on other systems. Such as an attempt only worsens the world's relationship, a confirmation of the total lack of know-how in the areas of coding and uncoding one's own life. But let's go back to the concept of crime. The individual is seen to be responsible for his crimes. He is either conscious or unconscious of it. It is only committed by him. The Western expression to commit a crime does not seem to have any historical or cultural implication. But in the case of the Congo, their expression to bear a crime, there are cultural, linguistic, social, environmental, genetic, and biological roots. So pause, take a step back, not done yet. The distinction: in the West, an individual commits a crime. In Congo, the individual bears a crime. I'm going to finish up the quote, but put a pin in that. The individual, before committing any crime, carries a certain set of learned communal concepts, images, expressions, symbols, and facts upon diverse social scenes. For the Bantu, a crime is the result of an internal psychological state carried out by an individual since its childhood, mainly accompanied during a period of growth when the child acquires social patterns. That state is given to him by social, cultural, physical, systematic environment within which he is bathed by negative as well as positive waves. Crimes are not individual acts. They are social creations which do not appear until later, and at that moment they are committed by an individual who is only symptomatic of the criminal radiation accumulating within the society. Crimes are found within social and cultural patterns, in the food, in the way the society eats, in its taboos, its language, vocabulary. Before he goes to initiation in Africa or to school in other societies, the child learns such concepts as steal, kill, etc. It is this kind of socialization the concept of crime is transmitted to members of a particular cultural system. African people believe the reason for committing a crime is relative to the crime in social, cultural systems in which he lives. In other words, a social system either favors or does not favor crime. When a crime is committed, judgment should not only be passed on the criminal, but also on the entire community in which the crime found its roots. A community in which a man or woman poisons his or her spouse will have trouble finding new alliances. No one will shake their hands. And someone from the community, no one will deal with them politically as a community. In society in which people believe in the concept of bearing crimes for possibly committing them, punishment is first considered communally before an individual matter. And as a consequence, the elder discipline of the young is very important. The Congo society is a good example of society where the entire social structure is basically a taboo system. The most important taboos are those related to the land, goods from the land, and all matters related to the community name. As such, most of what are considered crimes are related to the issue of land and the source of all goods for the survival of life. So that's something far more than a mouthful. And if you're wondering where this came from Foucault's book. So this diunital concept, this focus on crime is a communal concept. Violations against the land as the most central thing, and violations of community and the community's name are central, if necessary to understand what is even considered criminal in the African worldview, what is not considered criminal. So let's recap some of the things we just heard in that quote, because I know it was very long and it wasn't on screen. Crime is not done by individuals. It's the individual bearing the criminality of the community. Extended subjectivity, reciprocal obligation. The neoliberal village, it takes a village, versus the child belongs to the whole village and is accountable to them. So we're going to get to that in just a second. We may know the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. Foucault is actually telling us the way that's interpreted in the West is a mistranslation and or out of context. And that mistranslation is going to be important to understanding some of what's going on here. Acts of sexual ethics beyond the letter of the law. Diunital. What is lawful can be criminal. What is criminal can be part of systems of honor and obligation. Political interventions, criminality, are measured by whether an action furthers the cultural and spiritual infrastructure, capitalism, leaders' actions, or public crimes. Focus on using intergenerational transmissions of taboos. This is just me having a bit of fun. These kids are bad. We got to give them a rec center. I swear to goodness, anybody knows what I'm talking about, put it in the chat. Every time you go to a community meeting where there are elders, they say, we got to give these kids a rec center. They'll talk bad about the kids for about 10 minutes, and then they'll scream, we have to give them a rec center. For me, this quote helps understand that, because the ability to socialize the youth, the ability as elders to discipline the youth, is a necessary system to transmit cultural lessons that they see as the core of crime prevention. So it's almost like they don't make sense. If the kids are so bad, why give them a rec center? But they see the rec center not as like they're going to play basketball, so they're not shooting each other. It is the space through which the community can transmit cultural systems to them that they believe are at the root of an African-centered vision of crime. And if you understand what I'm saying, the rest of this talk is going to be a lot easier. If not, I'm going to try to work with you. We're going to figure it out. So I'm going to give you a case study. This is a case study from Baltimore, but it's going to set up the end of our talk where we're going to give you tangible applications of this theory to other criminal justice ventures that we have worked on that you might be working on. But this case study is important because I think it's a very good encapsulation to understand what Foucault was talking about in lived flesh. So we know the phrase "takes a village to raise a child," but when you actually Google it, who is it associated with? It's associated with Hillary Clinton, right? Because she actually co-opted that phrase in the early 90s. And it's important to understand this village concept has been co-opted in political campaigns. So let's start before the Clintons come in, before the 90s, before the nonprofits, before the I feel your pain or whatever, right? So collective courage is Jessica Gordon Nemhart's analysis of independent Black cooperative organizations. So she actually gives examples from Baltimore, like the Galilean fishermen, so the fisher of men, like Black fraternal organizations, helping to pay each other's medical bills, helping to pay each other's funeral bills, doing socialization, Black male socialization like that done in the Arch Social Club at the corner of Pennsylvania and North in Baltimore City, one of the oldest Black social clubs still in existence and use today, is a political theory of the village that led to much of the community control Black power work in the 60s and 70s. So this is Walter Carter. Walter Carter was head of Baltimore's, one of the leaders in our version of CORE, and one of our leaders of the community development organizations that came from the war on poverty. He was explicit about putting that money under community control and having community people run the poverty programs in Baltimore. He was eventually forced out by our future white mayor and governor, William Donald Schaefer. But people in places like Sandtown, Winchester still remember people like Walter Carter working on housing, working on giving money to programs for use as part of a village indigenous communal system. Flip side of the village is someone like Lil Willie. Little Willie is the notorious number runner, who was one of the folks who ran Numbers. So Numbers is our version of the lottery, a Black indigenous system where you basically, would just do a lottery, but we controlled it. So the rumor is he ran out the Italian mafia from Baltimore, and he actually supported political campaigns all throughout West Baltimore. And many people in Baltimore of a certain age will tell you, I got my first job from Little Willie. So here's an example of what the village looked like when we indigenously controlled it. So we actually have the transition of the village into the neoliberal village in the 90s. This is a quote from Harold McDougall about the Nehemiah Project, which was a federally funded reinvestment project in the 90s in Sandtown, Winchester, Freddie Gray's neighborhood. He writes, quote, community resident Athena Young carried out a street survey in Sandtown with my assistance in the summer of 91. Diversity we observed in our first assessment was amazing. We passed evidence of Muslim and Black nationalist activity, a Muslim carryout on Carey Street, Nation Builders bookstore on North Avenue, the home of a Rastafarian with the Haile Selassie album handwritten apocalyptic messages posted in his window. On Black Business Row on North Avenue across from Nation Builders bookstore, Black street vendors who lived in the area came out around lunchtime and stayed until dark. Arabbers, Black vendors who sell fruits, vegetables, and fish from horse-drawn wagons in West Baltimore gathered in Winchester Street. A stable of Sandtown senior Arabber whose name is Fatback. They collected their produce and merchandise to sell on the streets of Sandtown. Fatback's stable was later bulldozed to make way for the Nehemiah Project, end quote. So we're seeing a village, an indigenous village, that people are being socialized through race work. And literally the infrastructure of that village was demolished in favor of what was sold to the community as crime prevention, economic development, and all the things you are selling your policies as today. And you may believe your policies are different. The community is skeptical because of this history. So, for example, we had a market. It was painted in like African-ish zebra print looking stuff. Murray's sells, I have fond memories, but just like chicken tenders, steakums, like really bad processed food. But they brought the Dollar General in, which is the picture on the right. But if you look real closely, they brought a police substation into the Dollar General. So they didn't just bring new buildings, which was one of their critical visions of what development looked like. They brought nonprofits that fit their vision of what human development should look like in the Black community. So no, I'm not saying this nonprofit was brought in. This is just my example of the types of nonprofits community feel accompany this type of development. This is Orchestra Kids. Orchestra Kids takes folks from the hood and teaches them how to play violin. I like classical music, but a lot of people from the community feel like this sort of socialization into what is seen in a Eurocentric concept of high culture is white saviors telling the community, you aren't civilized. We have to civilize you. The best way for you to survive and advance, the Black person, is to get out of the hood. And we're going to help some of you do that. And I know you can't read this map, but just understand that when you invest money in a community like Sandtown, Winchester, you want to protect your investment. How do you protect your investment? Every line on that map is drawn to what's called a drug nuisance abatement zone. So that is an area of heightened war on drugs policing in the 90s that accompanied this massive residential and commercial development. And so nowhere on this map is Fatback stable. Nowhere on this map is the indigenous infrastructure of community institutions. What they perceive as blight, they are eliminating blight, and they are installing institutions that they think are good. And what's the result? So this is the map of cannabis arrests in Baltimore that explode in the 90s. If you look at Sandtown, Winchester, we're looking like right around here, Sandtown, Winchester, just all green, not despite the investment, not despite the progressive leftist Clintonite, no doubt, but still calling themselves progressive leftist folks saying we're going to invest in community, but because of it. And this is the epicenter of the Baltimore uprising in 2015. This is Freddie Gray's hood that blew up not because of this investment, as the standard leftist narrative says, but because of forms of investment that violated the village. That certain people were able to get out the hood and leave Sandtown, and the folks that were left without investment in the indigenous infrastructure of institutions, because the only jobs you could get were either hustling or if you got some ability, work at the nonprofits they're bringing in. But they don't reflect your culture. They don't reflect the system of honor and obligation. And the community felt so dishonored after Freddie Gray was arrested that they had their uprising, right? So now and only now does the data make sense, right? So we're actually going back to the data. So if you give me a second, so if you understand everything we've been talking about, because elders value Walter Carter in their memories of indigenous Black race work institutions, they're actually more likely to support investments in land trust and homelessness. I believe, and this is just my personal belief, younger folks have experienced more white savior versions of these programs, and so they may actually be less likely to support them. And that may actually explain the delta in the data. So again, ending restrictive policies that penalize people, get people into jobs, get people into housing. Black folks understand crime as cohesive in a cultural concept to not having access to the honor of having your own house, the honor of having a job. The ability to work is to live an honorable life and serve the community. Elders actually value that as a form of crime prevention over more traditional progressive interventions on crime. And again, prime example, this is what all the setup was for, right? Ending the practice of forcing prisoners to fight fires, so clean up debris for less than $1. Older Black folks say, look, I don't love it, because they do support it, but I want to see some system of honor and people recognizing the violation they did to the village. I want some system of accountability. I want to see people be serving in some way to be assets to the village. The child must be made an asset to the village. And if cleaning up debris on the side of the street is the mechanism to do that, then some people are saying so be it. Of course, young folks, they're not rocking with that so much. But the question is why? You don't have to agree with it. You have to understand why. And you have to give them systems of accountability that can replace these systems to fulfill that cultural communal need, not chastise them for wanting them. Because it's coming from a cultural system that you may not be even understanding how that cultural system of obligation and wanting recompense is working, right? So we're running out of time. I'm going to try to get to as many examples as I can. I'm going to have to leave some off. But I want to give you one example that happened to me just last week. Because we got to understand that these systems of analysis don't just come from the Miss Joneses. They come from other people who may be the granddaughter or extended, the extended, that's your mama, but it's not your mama, right? So take someone who's late 40s, 50s. They're working on abandoned homes in that community. And what they understand is they feel like they're never going to be safe in that community until they get the abandoned homes dealt with. So this is The Wire, Snoop, and Chris were putting bodies in abandoned homes. And you may be telling folks crime is declining. We need to focus on other ways of dealing with crime. But they know as long as those abandoned homes are there, there's the possibility that you'll be able to hide bodies there. They also know the street game is not evil people doing these murders. It is part of the necessity to use violence in a street economy. So they know that as long as the street economy is there, there's a possibility for the people they love to be swept up in that system and either become perpetrators of violence or victims of violence. So they do want to see accountability, but not just about the violent crime, but about the blight that produces the violent crime. So I was on the call where the sister was like, who are the slumlords? Who are the hedge funds buying up all the abandoned homes in Baltimore? Because they are holding them. They are not doing anything to improve them. They are just holding them as an asset. And I think that's criminal. I think these folks should go to jail. This is someone who is an advocate with us on criminal justice reform, an advocate for reparations on the war on drugs. But she's like, that act of capitalism is a crime. And for not them. because they are producing the visions of criminality, the vibrations. If you walk by abandoned homes every day, that's going to make you feel like your life is valueless and the people around you life is valueless, so you can take that life. And that is straight out of Fukuyama, about the vibrations and cultural symbols people perceive as being part of the nexus of criminality, how it's interpreted in our community. So that takes someone like her, this hypothetical person, but a real person, who is an otherwise criminal justice advocate, that's like, yeah, I think they should go to jail. Or at least take their money, take their houses, give them to us. So that they're not stuck on jail being the only answer, but it's like, yeah, if they gotta go to jail, they gotta go to jail. Because they are producing a vision of social organization that destroys the village. And violations to the village must be addressed. So we're going to recap. I know it's a lot, and then we're going to get into a few case studies, and then we're going to hit the Q&A. Appreciate all y'all's time. Leave your name in the chat. Leave your question in the chat. We're going to hit the Q&A. We're doing all right on time. I'm going to see what I can do. So lessons from pondering statement 2. Remember the statement. I agree with y'all, but some of these folks is a problem. White liberals fail to value indigenous vernacular systems. One cannot dance easily in a borrowed rap. That's what that's about. It's an exogenous culture. It's an external culture. Co-opted village rhetoric. Black elders have been burned by reform promises in the past. So they've been told it takes the village to raise a child by Hillary Clinton, told we're going to invest in y'all, and it didn't work out right. Services and investments fractured social fabric and brought in foreign systems of value by which success was evaluated. When you talk to people in Nehemiah, the rehab project, they said the only thing they could see as progress was buildings, physical buildings. They could not see human systems of connection development as progress because that was not the way they viewed the world. These were not all white people. These were people socialized in a Eurocentric way of viewing the world that viewed quantitative, materialist, physical projects as progress. And they did not value the intercommunal interconnections that we value as African people. Investments were not failed. They were criminal in the African worldview. So this is like, well, I get it's not perfect, but, you know, we getting you more money. We getting you more progress. No, these things are not failed. These are crimes. These are actual, Nehemiah was a crime in some people's view. The white saviorism bringing in these institutions to hustle off our suffering is a crime. And it's not enough for you to say it's like, yeah, we know that it'd be annoying, but, you know, they're still doing good stuff. No, it is a violation of the cultural concept of the village, and it is not acceptable to a large section of Black folks who are socialized in this worldview. Children belong to the village. Thus, the community demands the right to determine the conditions of reentry and reassimilation of those who have harmed the village. Children must be made access to the village. And again, that may sound harsh from a Eurocentric, individualistic point of view. Kids should be free. Kids should have fun. Kids should have systems of agency and autonomy. And again, a diunital worldview here. This is not to say that they are totally subject to the whims of elders. It is to say you cannot be a predator upon the community, and you must be socialized in the culture of the community and negotiate your freedom around the taboos of the community. Investment without community control seeks socialized use against the village and plucks them away from it. So this is the white saviorism. This is very important because when you come selling them about progressive budgeting, we're going to raise taxes on the rich, we're going to pump money into your community, they're like, I don't know about that. and that's not conservatism. That's not even being anti-tax. That is who you bringing in. Who are they people? Who are these people? What is the cultural system they use to evaluate the work that they're doing? And can I have a say in that? So I'm gonna get on the good foot. I'm gonna get right to the case studies. Y'all talk a lot, but y'all ain't gonna do nothing but help you and your people. So this is the idea that Black suffering is an industry and racial progress is subject to when it helps folks in power. Many of you know this person. This is Derek Bell. Derek Bell is a former civil rights attorney, worked with Thurgood Marshall on civil rights cases, became a law scholar, a father of critical race theory, began to question the civil rights movement, basically arguing things like Brown v. Board. They occurred in ways that ended up benefiting the powerful. So Black people only make progress when it converges with the interest of powerful people. That's interest convergence in his mind. Now, interest convergence gets read as it's fatalistic, that nothing we can do, white people only help us when it helped them more. No, the real argument is that we need to force what is in our interest to be in their interest. We're going to lever political consequences against them. We'll get to that at the end. But let's actually keep going on this interest convergence point. This is the demographics of who protested in 2020. If you can see, actually, the plurality of the folks who are protesting in 2020 were white, right? Nonprofit sector, if you actually read 2019 report, 10 million jobs. Private workforce, total employees numbering $12.3 million. The nonprofit sector is an industry. It is one of the biggest industries in America. And who is the majority of people working in the nonprofit sector? Women. Again, racially diverse, but women. And who delivered the election for Joe Biden? Women, particularly multicultural suburban women. I have a whole talk talking about the 2020 election, not rehashing that now. But the point is, again, white liberals supported defunding police more than blacks, in part because, as I mentioned in my podcast, the reality is that progressive redistribution is functioning as a jobs program for the Democratic base. And I know that may be hard for some people to hear, but given all the data I just laid out about who's voting for Biden, things like the American Rescue Plan Act, things like this 50-year history going back to the 70s and the battles over community control, where people like Walter Carter were forced out by people like William Donald Schaefer because of this dynamic, because of the billions of dollars being pumped into the black community being a source of political and economic power for a lot of people. This is big business. Servicing black suffering is a big business. So you have to understand the history of so-called progressive criminal justice investments through the lens of people perceiving our desire for criminal justice as a tool they can exploit, but people not wanting to challenge the hegemony within their own industries that are created. So justice reinvestment. Justice reinvestment was a program for criminal justice reform coming out of the 2010s, supported largely by Center for American Progress, but other centrist leftist think tanks as well, basically arguing we had over-incarcerated, we can cut the incarceration rates and save money. Reinvest that money into community, economic development, community nonprofits. People were really enthused, believing that this was the sort of progressive leftist investment in community that had been promised. What happened with justice reinvestment? This is a book, Justice Reinvestment, Can the Criminal Justice System Deliver More or Less? How many states, over 30 states, did some version of justice reinvestment? Remember, get rid of low-level drug crimes. Get rid of some technical violations. Calculate how many fewer people were in jail. Calculate the economic value of each person not in jail anymore. Redistribute that money to community. How many states actually reinvested money into communities through justice reinvestment? I'll give you a pause to take a guess. Was it 20? 15? The answer, of course, is 0. Because when people looked at the numbers, the math wasn't mathing the way that they thought it would math. You really got to shut a prison down in order to save the money. So just getting less people in the prison, you still got to have all the guards, all the food, all the electricity. Wasn't saving that much money. Also, most of the nonviolent drug offenders already were not in jail by that time. Most of the people in jail are in for relatively minor so-called violent offenses, second-degree assault. You get in a fight, you already got a record, everybody gets brought in and you're told to plead because, you already are a prior conviction. But then they give you 10 years. Those are the people in jail now. They weren't impacted by justice reinvestment. And when they looked at the money they had, which was much less than they thought, they said, we don't do grant making. We don't do economic development. We're going to reinvest it in like the criminal legal system, like pretrial, like parole and probation. Like stuff that they can sell as better than incarceration, but still the criminal legal system. So the bill sold to Black people literally as a form of reparations for the war on drugs ended up putting more money into the criminal legal system. This is the system of betrayal, and this is the cultural system of violation that Black elders who know what justice reinvestment is. You may not know what justice reinvestment is. There's some Miss Johnson out there that does and remembers it, remembers how they got gassed up. And they said, that's not doing nothing. And 10 years later, they said, I told you it wouldn't do nothing. What are you doing that's different than that? Because this is not, this is not only CAP. This is a lot of people pushing this framework. So one personal example, spiritual deficits of the professional left. I'm going to give a whole talk next month about violence prevention. But this is a call I was on from a Maryland Violence Prevention Coalition. So these are people that are in, like, people do services for victims of domestic violence. And there was someone on the call presenting data around why guns don't keep people safe. And they had all the standard answers. You're not going to stop someone doing a mass shooting. All the standard answers about why gun carrying doesn't keep you safe. And I was telling this person, I hear your data, it's pretty persuasive, but in my community, you never spoke to the dynamic where people feel they have to have guns for deterrence from other people in their communities. Because if you've been in an underground economy, a street organization, or if you're formerly in the underground economy or street organization, there are people who may perceive you as an enemy who want to do harm to you, and you need to deter them from doing harm to you. And he said, whatever. It's like, this is really talking about like people in Oklahoma who believe they got to carry a gun to stop a mass shooting. And it's like, yeah, but I hear what you're saying, but I'm talking to people in the community. And they're saying, look, I hear what you're saying, but I got to carry my gun because people in community know who carry guns. They know who have guns in the house. And if I don't have my gun on me, I don't want to carry my gun per se. But if they know I don't have a gun, they may pursue retribution against me or my friends or my street organization against me at that time. I got to defend myself or at least deter them with a gun. And he was like, blah, 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 blah. But look, if gun carrying made people safe, Baltimore would be the safest city in America. And I thought, that's not a crazy answer from a Eurocentric professional leftist community argument. It's a little flippant, a little dismissive. But from the perspective of someone who understands that carrying a gun is a spiritual choice that Black men are choosing, largely Black men are choosing, that is destroying our community, that is wrenching their hearts, that is putting them in positions existentially where they have to be ready to take somebody's life, and also understanding that the industry of violence prevention is becoming $1 billion industry because of the fear of Black men shooting each other, and you had nothing to say about the primary reason why your whole industry exists except some flippant joke. That is a violation of the existential ethics by which I evaluated my politics. But in his rhetorical ethics, that was a funny joke. And I want you to understand, this is how a lot of y'all sound to a lot of Black people. You may not mean to sound disrespectful, but if you don't understand this is a life or death situation in terms of the stuff we're talking about, it's not a job for us. It is an existential connection to preserving the possibility of a village to reproduce itself. It is thinking about a Black man carrying a gun like I know that person. And they're thinking about their kids. And they're thinking about the cultural system of obligation that requires them to carry a gun. Because you hear people say things like, man, I don't want to retaliate. My friend got killed. I don't want to retaliate. If I don't retaliate, I can never talk to my mother again. And it's not his real mother. It is his mother from the extended subjectivity of the street organization that raised him and protected him. These are complex, nuanced realities that are not caught in data. And when you boil them down to data, you speak on the issue in a way that violates our cultural relationship to how we evaluate this politics, right? And again, this was violence prevention. This could have been anybody, any day. A few more, we're going to wrap up the Q&A. I appreciate all y'all rocking with me this long. I'm not going to get through all of them, but I'm going to try to get through what I can get through. All right, I'm going to go back. I'm going to do this one. School lunch. This is being sold as a crime prevention tool. Kids are hungry, brain development, they need nutrition. John Oliver did a segment on school lunch, and as soon as he said school lunch, people started clapping. I'd never seen it. It emotionally feels so cathartic to think about feeding hungry kids. It feels even crazy to put it up for analysis. But you can see it just being framed through the lens of violence prevention, neurochemical disruption, and brain hunger to prevent aggressive behavior. But I want you to actually think about this. Did y'all eat school lunch? I ate it. It was not very healthy. It was actually kind of disgusting. So the idea existentially, socially, of this being the definition of liberation for Black people is a little bit insulting to me. And actually kids in 2015, when the Obama administration, spearheaded by Michelle Obama, changed the school lunch, the kids started tweeting and Instagramming, this stuff sucks, thanks Michelle Obama. Because what they were being fed was not nutritious, right? It was, better than it was before, but this cannot be the definition of food security. This is just one meal. So the way liberals and progressives focus on getting kids food in school, it's not the kids not eating is important. It's that you can only imagine it happening in school because you do not imagine, like the Arabers, those folks carrying food in the Black community, indigenous Black systems of race work that can serve this function so much better. Right? So think about the Black Panthers free breakfast program. right? And so now the federal breakfast program existed before the Panthers school breakfast program. But why was the federal government so vigorous in enforcing and funding school breakfast? Now you can argue it was to undermine the Panthers. It didn't happen because of the Panthers, but it was actually vigorously enforced, one could argue, because the Panthers were socializing people through a system of race work in their school breakfast programs. Also think about food. Food is used often as a synonym for drugs and a synonym for money. So you can feed people's bodies in school, but you cannot feed their souls. People do not go to the corner only for money. They go to the corner because they want to have a system of making money to help their family that respects their autonomy, does not require them to do forms of embarrassing and oftentimes degrading service economy work. So you can feed their bodies, but you cannot feed their souls the way the Panthers did. Panthers were not just feeding people, they were feeding their souls in ways that kept them off of the corners, that told them there was a system of white supremacy making them want to kill their fellow man, that it was political systems putting heroin in our community. And if you're not doing that, you're not preventing no crime, obviously. I shouldn't even have to tell you all that. But we have whole academic institutions and leftist progressives telling us school lunch going to prevent crime. It sounds ridiculous. Quite frankly, I'm sorry, it sounds ridiculous. But this is also the reality. This is a jobs program for the nonprofit industrial complex. Not explicitly all white, as this photo shows. And I'd say food bank doesn't do good work. But the idea is that only giving out calories, the food bank can count calories and have a bureaucratic system to give out calories. The actual nutritional content of that is not always central. But more importantly, I'm still dependent on the food bank for my food and my survival. As a human being, existentially, culturally, the village does not have a system to control for itself being able to feed people as an extension of village care for the kids. And that's not going to be acceptable to the village, right? Which is why when we were in 2014-15, we got brought into a turkey drive. Who brought us into the turkey drive? For Eddie Conway, the Black Panther, right? So this is about things that we've done in the community. And newsflash, this is how we successfully message on anti-violence and progressive criminal justice work. It's because we did stuff like this. It's because we understood the culture of the community and performed actions beyond criminal justice work that fed within the cultural system of honor and obligation and indigenous cultural conceptions of our community that gave us credibility on the other stuff. Yeah, it's so many examples. I don't even know what to do. We're going to do this one. The left's fatal anxieties around institution building. So let's go back to James Forman. Black bourgeoisie, Black elites, Black elected officials. People are understandably on the left somewhat reticent about them, especially in the days of Kamala. But if you look at the work of someone like Amos Wilson, Blueprint for Black Power, he talks about most people experience power as power over, as power to do harm and violence to someone. So the left has rejected nuanced study of people who've built power because the assumption is if you seek power, you must be trying to dominate someone. So seeing power as the power to protect, the power to build the village has not been central on the American left because it has been framed through the language of if you're seeking power, you're hustling for your own personal good, you're a capitalist, you're a Black capitalist, or you just have a power fetish. So let's talk about some examples of building power to people like Perrin Mitchell. Perrin Mitchell was the first Black elected person to the House from Maryland since Reconstruction. He actually, along with Walter Carter, ran some of the poverty programs in Baltimore. He was part of the Congressional Black Caucus, supported Shirley Chisholm, one of the very few members of the CBC who supported Shirley Chisholm, came out against the Vietnam War. But he understood, he caught the train home to Baltimore every day from Congress. So he understood he had to have a jobs program to feed Black people in the community. So he was credited with changing the minority set-aside program in federal construction policy. What does that mean? When the federal government builds stuff, they have to hire companies to build it. He said, you need to make sure at least 10% of those companies that build this stuff in this country are Black-owned. And this book, Black Power at Work, details the work Black people had to do against the construction unions, the racist construction unions that excluded them, to be able to build the cities that had burnt down in 1968. Racism burnt down those cities. People like Perrin Mitchell said, we are going to rebuild it, and the federal government's going to support that. And again, the left does not see that sort of stuff as economic redistribution. People in community do. So that's one of the critical conceptual distinctions I want to center, because look at the total amount of money that goes into federal set-asides, $44 billion. That's bigger than the NFL, bigger than the entire hip-hop R&B industry. We're not going to talk about Diddy. $44 billion for federal construction set-asides. How many people does that employ? How many jobs does that create? This is a study from Dartmouth that says that cities that most vigorously applied minority set-aside laws had higher rates of Black business creation, above even white men. Why do we care about Black business creation? Are we capitalists? No, it's not about capitalism. It's about African-American entrepreneurship being a tool to decrease crime in the Black community. So this is statistical evidence that says that cities that most vigorously had higher rates of Black business creation had lower rates of violence during the 80s and 90s. So we're literally saving lives. Perrin Mitchell is literally saving lives, and more importantly, the Miss Joneses of the world, when they think of violence prevention, that's who they think about. They mention Perrin Mitchell. They mention not just control of the poverty programs, but control over the flows of money throughout the city to push them towards places more likely to employ, especially poor working class Black men. And that's not prioritizing their suffering over other people. That's realizing that if you do not give them employment, they are more likely to turn into threats to the village. People in the underground economy doing violence or robbing or being addicted to drugs. So even people like Huey Newton came around and talked about Black capitalism and said, look, we do not support capitalism, but we gotta be honest, as the Black Panthers, we took a lot of money from white capitalists to run our Black Panther programs, but we were really hard on the Black capitalists. The community said they didn't rock with that, and now I gotta listen to them. So when Eddie Conway was wrongfully incarcerated, wanted to create a prison union against prison labor when he was wrongfully incarcerated in the 70s, who was there on the outside pushing from him as a lawmaker? Perrin Mitchell. As noted in this book, The Brotherly Truth by Susie Day. So this is the complexity of the political realities that the left just ignores. I told you there's going to be stuff that Ms. Jones knows that you don't know. Did you know anything that I just told you about any of the people, any of those systems, any of that research? But so many people on the left so axiomatically say that it's just Black bourgeoisie politics, it's just Black conservatism. There's no there, right? So I'm gonna have to skip a lot of this stuff. Lord have mercy, I can't believe I'm gonna have to. But I'm trying to see what's the thing I actually want to leave you on. And I think I'm just going to have to skip all the way to the end. If you have any questions about any of these, violence prevention, let's do violence prevention. Because this is going to get back to the defund the police stuff, right? So violence prevention, we're going to do a whole nother talk on this in October. Please sign up at the end. If you have any questions about drug policy, any questions about policing, criminal justice, please ask those in Q&A. We're going to end on violence prevention. Alternatives to policing. So social workers responding to mental health calls. This is seen as axiomatically something people should support. But when you say public health alternatives to policing, you get a bit of a cold response in Baltimore because you got to think about who in Baltimore is public health. In Baltimore, public health is Johns Hopkins. So it's not just Henrietta Lacks stealing people's cells. Johns Hopkins is one of the chief gentrifiers of East Baltimore. And gentrification was one of the biggest drivers of violence. Because think about it. If you're in Middle East Baltimore, Hopkins pushes you out. Mama might buy a home in another part of the city, but you are still a poor working class Black person with no prospects. You're probably going to go back to the underground economy that you came from, but now you're on somebody else's turf. So it's actually very clear a migration of violence from Middle East Baltimore, where Hopkins is, to Northeast Baltimore as they are gentrifying that Middle East area. Not to mention the Hopkins police force. Hopkins is bad. And when you talk about public health as an alternative to policing, that's a lateral move. Let's also think about the narratives and scripts about public health and the academy and their views of mental illness. This is a book called The Protest Psychosis by Jonathan Metzl. He statistically charts the change in schizophrenia diagnosis from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. 50s, housewives. 60s and 70s, Black radicals. Because they were saying stuff like, the government's after me. And they were saying, oh, you're crazy, you're schizophrenic. Then we found out about COINTELPRO. So if you talk about centering the mental health establishment and public health, you have to deal with the real reality that mental and public health has been a tool of explicitly racialized social control in this country. trauma-informed care. I have a whole talk about this on the podcast. So one of the methodologies that we have to train people in trauma-informed care, train the responders, train the police. If you actually read this book, I have an extensive critique of it on our podcast. But one of the examples that I like to give about why this book is problematic is like, look at what he talks about as a solution to trauma. It is self-expression. It is affirmation. And he gives an example of a Filipino woman who basically is told by him to basically talk what she really thinks about her father and mother. And she's like saying that, you know, her father was abusive, but her mother was a walkover. Her mother was a shill. Her mother did not protect her. And he says, go to someone in the group to be your ideal mother. And she picks a white woman from the crowd. And she's like, I will protect you. I will take care of you. And it's like this beautiful cathartic moment. And let's get over the racial politics of a Filipino woman picking a white woman for just a second. From the African perspective of valuing elders and valuing the maternal family line, it's unacceptable to simply say your mother is a pushover without understanding all the other work they did to take care of you. Not just to excuse what the father did, but it is to say that just calling trauma-informed care, calling your mom a pushover, that would not be acceptable within the African cultural system. And there are other forms of trauma-informed care that do not center those forms of psychoanalytic expression, but value forms of connection, value forms of intercommunal accountability that actually allow you to deal with the complexity of childhood trauma in a way that does not pathologize your parents or potentially bring in criminal justice. Because you can say we should have taken her from her parents, we should have put them up from adoption, and then you're getting into the whole politics of, you know, separating families. But let's look at also when you tie violence prevention to the state, you get people like Roca, who's a violence prevention program that's being sold as a best practice because they do cognitive behavioral therapy with people who are known to be adjacent to the street gang. So they basically go to people who they know are tied to the street gang and say, look, you're on the list of potential being shot or shooters. We're going to give you jobs, give you life skills, and teach you how to control your impulses. But one of the things they do is they work directly with police. And this is actually a quote from one of the speakers at Roca, who is being promoted as an alternative to policing, saying, look, I go to the police and say, look, if Johnny is not at Roca, and you find him with a dime bag of weed, process him, put him in the system. That's going to bring him back to me at Roca. They in Massachusetts, weed is legal in Massachusetts, right? And not thinking from a trauma-informed perspective, the trauma of that police engagement, the trauma of that police involvement, the real possibility of police brutality. These are the people that many leftists are promoting as an alternative to police, a public health alternative to policing. With public health alternatives like this, who needs policing, right? So if we go back to Ms. Jones, we understand that her system of evaluation is actually a response to each of the points about the standard progressive narrative on crime. So it's not a question of wasting money on police. If there's an investment in Black community disempowerment, and it goes from left to right. It's not just a question of de-incarceration. We must have prospects for them to return back to. So we must do community-based economic educational development. Not just defund the police and fund public health. Public health is a tool of community surveillance and community control. If public health is about controlling disease, we are the disease they're trying to control too often in public health. And instead of defunding police, build community-based power. If we have the power, we'll get the money. So again, justice reinvestment, they said cut the budget. We never got the money. We need the political power, and that's going to be the tool for reinvestment. Because when you say criminal justice reform saves money, when we go back in to get the money, they say, oh no, as a lawmaker, you promised me cost savings. You promised me it was going to help the budget. I'm not going to just give you the money. You promised me it was going to get the budget deficit down, so I can't give it back to the community now. So again, leftist progressives thinking they're helping us, actually hurting us. Broad-based economic distribution? No. Specific investment in political institutions and containers should be controlled by Black people. Prison police abolition. Eventual liberation of the internalized colony, nation of Black people in the USA. Police and prison abolition will come as a result of that, because remember, in our societies, we have no jails, right? So again, this is not a noble savage argument. This is not saying that Ms. Jones's views are perfect and she'll never not be wrong. these are conceptual tools for you to understand how better to message on this issue. Because again, I was going to do the work that we did on criminal justice, what we said. We ain't say nothing that special. It was just like the Fukuyama quote. He kept saying, I'm going to talk about culture. I'm going to talk about this. Let me get back to crime. I forgot about crime. I forgot about crime on this talk, to be honest with you. Or at least I forgot to give you specific messaging tools about how to message about crime, because it's not about the messaging. If you do not accompany your advocacy with intentional investments in community, nothing you say will matter. So this talk is not going to give you magic words to message your policy to Black people. There are none. It's about understanding the conceptual system of analysis that they use to understand crime is different than yours. And you have to be able to engage that effectively. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you all. We got there. It took us a while, but please check out the podcast and Search of Black Power. Please check out, if you're in Baltimore, check out our New Timbuktu seminars. So we do them every summer. This is professional development for people in nonprofits and advocacy spaces. And next talk is October 16th. We are doing a talk on the specific politics of violence prevention. So community-based violence prevention is a huge topic now in our community. They've had a lot of successes. And again, public health is giving a lot of the credit. What are the politics of the election? How do they interact with this? Trump versus Kamala. And please use the QR codes, use the links in the chat. Sustainers are people who give us money every month. They help fund our political work. The evaluation is your middle QR code. Please sign up if you wish to for the violence prevention talk. That's going to be on Zoom, because we want to be able to know exactly who we're talking to, give you more direct feedback, and know exactly who's in the room, and give you more ability to speak to us. So if you could type your questions via chat, that'd be great. Adam will give them to me. The Zoom call will give us more time to speak back and forth, give us a more intimate setting. And yeah, I really appreciate y'all rocking with us. There was a lot. I had even more in store. But if you have any questions of all the things that I skipped, drug policy, police accountability, please do that in Q&A. And I really appreciate y'all. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Lawrence. So I've seen there's quite a few people in the chat who have had some questions during the presentation. So while some of you may have, you may be mulling around, what questions you want to ask based on what you've heard tonight, I just want to make sure that people know that, number one, that those links you just saw, those QR codes, I don't know if Lawrence...
Yeah, can you bring those QR codes back up on the screen? You can make me small.
All right, cool. Yeah, I don't think you guys stop sharing your screen. So that's fine. The links are in the chat for everyone watching.
I'll bring the screen share.
Yeah, it's fine. So everyone watching, you can, if you look in the chat, if you're on Facebook, on LinkedIn, or if you're on the StreamYard webinar, you can see the links. So please sign up to become a sustainer. You can register for the next event happening in October. And also, we want you to take a brief survey so we can know what you thought of today's conversation. We would love to hear your feedback. And hopefully we can continue to offer this type of free programming in the future. So when you support LBS, you're supporting free public education and awareness around these issues, and also independent Black political activism and advocacy in Baltimore. So we want to thank you for that. Also want to give a big shout out to everybody who was able to check in with us on the chat. We got Zachary Alberts, Ingrid, Sabio McLaughlin, I know I pronounced that wrong. Thank you, Ingrid. We also have Alana Bowie, Cynthia Newcomer, Josiah Jacobs, Linda Green, Rihanna Eckel, Fergal Malali, Kelly Quinn, Eleanor Fleming, T. Mason, Gregory Brown, Yannette Emanuel. What up, Yannette? John Spillane, Alice Wilkerson, Owen O'Keefe, and many, 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 many more people who have checked in with us over the evening. So thank you so much for staying locked in with us this evening. Quick question, Lawrence. A few people have asked about the slides. Did you want to make them available? Because I think some folks were just asking about having being able to look at the slides later.
Yeah, so that's actually something that I was just talking to the team about. So the way I do slides is actually the slides are my outline. So every picture you saw was not an individual slide. It'd be like hundreds of slides if that was the case. Every slide is a point, and each point has multiple pictures fading in and out on it. So me giving you the slides would not do you any good. I'm sorry. Like, it's just me giving you the slides would be just jumbles of pictures on a page, and you'd be clicking through them trying to connect the connections in your brain. The connections are in my head. They're not written down anywhere, right? So me sharing the slides would not be effective. What would be effective is emailing us, but also going back to our podcast. Almost everything I've talked about in this talk, we have podcasts going more in depth on. So it's one of those things where it's not intentional, because it's how my brain works, but it's intentional because I don't want people to become too dependent on the slides. If you need a bibliography, you can go through the talk and get the bibliography. We may be able to publish something like that afterwards. But it's one of those things where this is going to be public. Going back and re-listening may be good. But the slides, how they work in Google Slides, you could watch them screen from one to another, but you're not going to have the connection. The only connection is me saying it. And that is in the video. That's going to be public, right? So I think it's important for you to look at the resources and get in the community to talk about the resources. Like Fukuyama is very difficult to read. He is from the Congo, right? So just even reading Fukuyama may not be helpful without having people to help you guide you. But what would be helpful is to go back and look over some of our other materials about the other campaigns we've worked on, listen to our other podcasts that go more in depth about these specific topic areas. So it just wouldn't make sense to share the slides because they're done in a way where it would just be a random slew of pictures scrolling at you. And there's no logical flow to them except what you would get from the video.
All right, thanks, Lauren. So there's I think I've seen about 3 or 4 questions pop up that folks would like to be answered. So I see Bob has about 4 questions or 3 questions in here. And Bob, if you're still watching with us, I think that some of your questions are out of context. So I want to make sure that we are capturing what you're putting for a couple of these. But one of these says, it seems the argument that you make is Eurocentric criminal justice looks at pure data. And I'm sorry, one second. It seems the argument you make is Eurocentric criminal justice looks at pure data, and we as Afrocentrists should not just take the quantitative approach, but one that listens to elders. So
that's part of it. So I think it's important, however, to note that this is not an anti-quantitative data analysis. Some people take that approach. I'm not one of them. What I'm saying is that what are the data points we should value? How do we evaluate holistically the implication of a policy when you put something like community control and who has decision-making power as a critical metric by how you evaluate a policy? And that can be quantified in some ways. So look at the people who are having decision-making power over where money flows. Who are they accountable to? Who are their bosses? You can track that somewhat quantitatively, which is part of the reason why we focus so much on public money as opposed to foundation money, part of why we're not a nonprofit. I cannot vote out the head of these big foundations doing this work in communities, right? But I can have influence on people in the public sphere, people who are elected. So it's also to note that, and again, I had to skip over so much stuff. I always do this. I put too much stuff in. If you look at the work being done on violence prevention, quantitatively, that work is successful. But the question is, how do we qualitatively evaluate why the success is happening? It is our argument that a community-centered view will value the work being done by organizations operationalizing a cultural perspective on violence prevention. But the Eurocentric worldview will tell us public health and the public health establishment, because they have the imprimatur, the branding of objectivity and science, that they're the reasons why murders are declining. So I think that's more where I'm going. And I think that that's a critical distinction, because that's a very dichotomous worldview, with all due respect, right? Is that it's not about, we got the data, so you got to listen to us. In fact, the dude on the call that I was talking about, that was his whole point. Well, the data is the data. And it's like, no, the data isn't the data. Because people are carrying guns in our community because these communities are laden with assaults and stabbings that never get reported to the police. And your data would never account for that. That doesn't make you a bad person. There's nothing you could do because the data is fundamentally incapable of capturing the full reality of Black life. But if you do not understand the limitations of the data, you're going to be out here saying, well, why are these folks carrying guns? It's because there are levels of violence happening in their communities that are so much higher than you could ever possibly know. So I think it is a tool to help us better evaluate quantitative data, but it's also a spiritual, moral, and epistemic frameworks to which we evaluate what to do with the data, right? So it's saying that it's not just the right thing to do to put money in the community to address violence. It's not going to work unless we do that, because the things that drive violence in our community are specifically cultural to that community. And you do not address those cultures exogenous to that community. One cannot dance easily in a borrowed rap.
All right. Thank you for that, Lawrence. So we have another question down here. It's actually a few questions mixed into one. I believe the lesson from this seminar is essentially listen to and understand during organizing. I'm wondering what are the next steps? How to support ideas involved in solving crime in the short term while also solving systemic issues with policing and poverty.
Well, yeah. Well, again, I had to cut the part specifically about grassroots violence prevention a little bit. But again, Baltimore, even beyond the 260 murder rate in 2023, we may be in the 200 this year. And we're going to do other talks in the future about the politics of violence prevention, how the public health establishment is getting credit for that. But also understand that Black folks have been doing violence prevention as soon as we got to the North. So part of what happened was that the race work tradition was interrupted by the social work tradition. So as we left the South, we left the containers of race work that for all the poverty and violence of the South helped give us tools to deal with some of that violence. And when we got to industrialized northern cities cut off from our family connection and institutions of the South, the northern migration was very violent, figuratively and literally. So you have levels of violence in the North that were dealt with Black social workers trying to inject levels of race work into social work. So what I'm saying is that what we do is we look at the policies that are supposed to support Black folk with public dollars and foundation dollars. They're all going to claim to support cultural competency. They're all going to claim to support indigenous valuable approaches to the work. This is tools to help you call BS on some of those claims and get you more precision as to what it would look like to actually evaluate liberatory methodologies and what does that mean for what we support in terms of foundation and public funding for services. So when we say that we don't support Johns Hopkins getting money for violence prevention to the exclusion of people in community leading the work, guiding the theory. Because again, I've given other talks on violence prevention that says if violence is a disease in America, who's patient zero? And I would say that's Christopher Columbus. And that it is the injected oppression of imperialism and slavery that is being reverberated into the criminality that's injected into our community. It is the poverty and the criminality of the violence of America that is being reverberated in our community, which again, Fukuyama's understanding of people bearing a crime almost being manifested through individuals via the cultural impoverishment of the culture through which they were raised, gives us concrete tools. Does your violence prevention methodology reflect that at all? Because what I know is the people getting the money for violence prevention have apprehensions about saying things like that, because that would implicate capitalism, that would implicate the institutions that fund the nonprofits that are trying to fund violence prevention work. Because we know a big part of violence prevention is wanting to gentrify cities. You cannot gentrify them if the murder rate's too high. So this is one of the critical things that I'm saying is that we have a lot of things happening with, no matter who wins the election, foundation funding, public funding that is being claimed to be invested in us, in services that really work and are controlled by community. No one's going to say, I want white saviors to get the money. No one's ever going to say that. But when we talk about the culture of African people, it's often abstract. It's often theoretical. What Fukuyama, what Ani, what Wilson do is give us tangible tools to flesh out not just violence prevention, but youth development, youth leadership development, addiction treatment, tools that utilize these methodologies work in our community. And there's data showing that work. Again, we're not anti-data, but this gives us tools as advocates to advocate more precisely into the foundation sphere, into the public sphere, about what it looks like to build funding systems, intermediary systems that are supporting the fostering of liberatory methodologies on all these questions. And critically, again, if you want to do criminal justice reform, it's going to be hard for you to get credibility in the community without having something intelligent to say about this question. This may be beyond your scope of work as a nonprofit. You may not get a grant for this. But if you do not understand this is part of the community's indigenous epistemology for how they view crime prevention, it's going to be very hard for you to organize the community. So these tools are from an interdisciplinary perspective of an organization that's not a nonprofit. We are not a nonprofit in large part because of the false divisions often forced into funding from foundations and nonprofits around this type of work. So the goal is to give you tools, but you have to work backwards to where you are, what institution you're in, what you're working on to figure out how that applies to your work. What I can lay out is some pieces of the intellectual and experiential landscape, and you have to figure out how you navigate where those truths land.
All righty. So we have one or two more. So one is pretty straightforward. What books would you suggest for supporting the proper cultural socialization of youth, especially for those involved in running youth-centered programs?
So I think the Fukuyama book is good. I would not start there. I would look at work from Amos Wilson, The Falsification of African Consciousness. I think that's pretty good. There are folks like Jawaza Kunjufu. There are folks like Naeem Akbar, his book Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. And again, not all these texts are specific to use, but they give you other texts that will give you ideas that can filter into youth development. I mean, that's Amos Wilson's, I believe it's The Psychology of the African Child. He has actual books on youth development. And again, part of what I'm saying is that these texts, this is not to create a holy canon. Part of the limitation, I believe legitimately, of some people's view of Afrocentricity and African thought is that folks get too enamored with worshiping the text. The texts need to come alive. The texts need to interact with the contemporary conditions and realities of modern use. So stuff you may be reading from a book in the 80s and 90s may give you nuggets of things to apply today, whether that's post-traumatic slave syndrome for Georgia Grew-Leary, whether that's, I wouldn't recommend starting with Urugu, but I'd recommend sort of building your way up to Urugu. These texts give you nuggets and pieces of a larger puzzle, but the answer can only be lived out in theory. So the biggest text I would ask you to lean towards is find people in your community, especially elders, but not exclusively elders, who have a solid perspective on youth development and just talk to them. And then listen to what they're saying to you. Look at some of the programming they've done, and then start looking at the text. Because you can't understand these theories outside the community. This is just words on the page. The Fukuyama text is good. It's like it's an embodied experience. Like we have to live an embodied relationship to these theories, and you have to be able to experience them. So not exclusively older people, because not all older people are elders, but I would especially look towards elders who have a solid perspective on youth development. They're not probably going to agree on what they think is ideal youth development, but you should listen. And again, part of the goal of this talk was you may not always agree, but understand why. And if you begin to have the empathy and understanding to see alternative epistemologies, then you can begin to approach these concepts better.
All right, so I think that actually wraps up our questions for the evening. Thank you, Lawrence, for the dope presentation, and thank all of you for attending this evening and joining the conversation. I also want to just remind you that, number one, there is a survey that we would love for you to fill out. And so if you look in the chat, if you're on Facebook, LinkedIn, or on the StreamYard, you'll actually see this link right here. And so when you go to the chat, just go ahead and click on it real quick. It takes less than a minute. All you got to do is just let us know what you thought of the talk this evening and give us a review of what you felt about it, if you thought it was useful, helpful, if you want to see more of these. Also want to remind you that you can become a sustainer today. So if you go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain, you can sign up and become a long-term financial supporter of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle and all the dope work that it does in Baltimore. And I also just want to remind you that there is, in fact, another event coming up next month. And actually, I can actually show you that for a second here. Let me see if I can pull it up on the screen. Lawrence was mentioning it a little bit earlier. As a matter of fact, while we have folks for just a few more minutes, Lawrence, I'll pull up the event. Would you mind telling folks what that event will be about next month?
Yeah. So when when we say community violence intervention, as I've stated before, the community has a holistic understanding of how it understands violence and crime prevention. But there's a burgeoning industry of programs that specifically claim to have evidence-based specific methodologies about how they are stopping violence. So many of them operate from a public health model. They are doing things like having credible messengers, formerly street-involved individuals, mediate conflict. They're claiming to use things like cognitive behavioral therapy to give people tools to get better impulse control. And because there is some success getting some of the violence, murder rates down in major cities, with the Kamala administration potentially coming in, these folks are looking to really, they've been underfunded for years. They've been looking to really try to establish themselves as an alternative public safety apparatus in America. And this is being heralded by many people on the so-called progressive left as an alternative to policing that is should be lauded and embraced and promoted. Part of our concern about this is that when you have a critique of the nonprofit industrial complex, when you have critique of public health methodologies, not understanding indigenous African views of public health, and not understanding the ways in which public health has been a tool of surveillance and control, an extension of capitalist systems, tying violence prevention to public health, tying it to the political apparatuses of the Democratic Party, creates some real limitations. So this talk is going to be before the election. And the idea is that if Trump gets in, he might cut these programs. If Kamala gets in, she might give him $50 billion. In either world, we as a community are going to have organizing to do to preserve the liberatory methodologies that are going to be critical to actually solving violence in our communities. So we're going to understand more what these programs do. We're going to understand more some of the criticisms, the limitations of these programs, and we're going to talk about the different trajectories of a Kamala and Trump presidency for the futures of these programs, arguing no matter who gets in, we as people interested not just in justice, but actually solving the problems of violence need to have a rigorous, community-based political plan to ensure that the liberatory methodologies that are the primary reason why violence is declining in the Black communities are either preserved from the starvation of austerity under Trump or the co-option of the nonprofit industrial complex under a potential Kamala administration. So especially if you're in those industries, but if you're in any foundation space, if you're in any space that is thinking about these issues, we hope you join us on Zoom in October because we really want to have feedback. We want to have people talk to us. That's going to be on, I believe, October 16th.
All right. And you heard them, folks. It's going to be on October 16th at 6 p.m. It's going to actually be via Zoom next time. So we really encourage you to join in. We want to give folks an opportunity to talk. We saw a lot of you stuck with us throughout the entire stream, but we also want to make sure that you can actually talk back when the presentation is finished. So all you got to do to register for this webinar, again, it is 100% free and open to the public. So all you got to do is sign in onto Eventbrite or go onto our website at lpsbaltimore.com. Go and register for the event and sign up today, and then you can join us next time in October on the 16th for our next talk. And also, I just want to remind folks that there's also an event happening tomorrow in person that is happening at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum. And let me actually pull that up really quickly. So this is actually about the recent ballot initiatives being sponsored by David Smith, executive chairman of Sinclair Broadcasting. And so if you're also interested in learning about local political work happening in Baltimore for LBS trying to stop these ballot initiatives, particularly question H, decreasing the size of Baltimore City Council, which would directly decrease Black political power, I encourage you to join that free public event as well at Reginald F. Lewis Museum. It starts tomorrow at 6 p.m. Just show up, come in, and be a part of the conversation. So yep, we are at 7:48. Really appreciate everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you again, Lawrence. And hopefully we will see you next time on here. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow night. And if we don't see you, we hope that you sign up to become a sustainer. So thank you again, and we will see you soon.